automation and employment in Ireland. So, Eric.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right. This is today. I'm going to talk to you about a paper myself and a colleague of mine, Nina Jacobs, prepared earlier this year, which looks at the impact of automation and digitalisation on the Irish labour market. Just as a brief bit of context for this, we're following on from the recession years. We've had an opportunity in the policy world to kind of pause and take note about basically where the emergent new challenges are coming from, and the automation obviously is going to be very much up there. And looking at the impact of that in the next, particularly over the next 2 decades, is vital to our own interests in terms of understanding where we need to make the investment in terms of skills, infrastructure, etc. So out of that kind of context, we decided in the department to just have a look at what work's already been done out there and what learnings we can take of that in terms of the Irish context. So what this paper essentially does, is taking work that's been done by economists and researchers in the OECD, and basically mapping it onto the Irish labour market, and just as a kind of a first attempt at kind of looking at what the destructive impact of automation is going to have, while not accepting the fact that there will be obviously jobs will be created as well, but nevertheless, from a policy perspective, it's also about ensuring that those people who are impacted by this, that we're able to direct the appropriate types of resources to support them. So, by the way, the paper is already up on the internet if you're interested afterwards too. It's on the IG's website. So IG's, for those of you who don't know, is the Irish Government Economic Evaluation Service, which has been up and running since 2012. So it's essentially, I suppose, the government's a demonstration of the government's commitment to bringing evidence to policy. So at least that's what the tagline says. Okay, so we'll just kick off then. Now this is probably the first time I've gone through this, so bear with me if my presentation style feels pretty crap. But anyway, let's go. So, the basic structure. I will just talk briefly about developments, what the recent studies are saying, tell you what essentially we did to get the results for Ireland, and then we did a little bit of supplementary analysis on that, and then I'll open it up to discussion. So to begin with, I suppose many of you here would already be familiar enough with the world of technology, but essentially the global ICT market is forecast to grow at 3%, and in terms of compound annual growth over the next 5 years, which is quite significant. And this is being driven by a strong growth market in emerging third platform technologies. There's various different lingo around this, but one of the ones that I think is probably best way to capture it is innovation accelerators. So essentially, this is a brief list, the type of things which are driving the digitalization and automation of the working world as we know it. So we have the Internet of Things, or we will have the Internet of Things, augmented reality, virtual reality, and obviously these are contingent on rollout of 5G networks, which we all know is it's up there, it's on the list, it's coming. But this is obviously going to have a very significant impact on how we do things, in terms of how our everyday working, etc. Similarly, cognitive computing and AI. I've seen 1 or 2 very interesting examples of where this has been applied already into the, let's say, public service delivery. I think it's Estonia. I could be mistaken for this, but it has introduced. There was a trial where they introduced a basically an AI which could interact with people over a screen. The AI was actually designed to look like a female human, and this person would then guide you through your engagements with their social welfare system. Quite striking, given that as a part of the public services, that system of direct engagement with people through social welfare requires quite a large number of people to deliver. Now, I'm not saying that you introduce an AI like that and that's going to magically get rid of all those people. But nevertheless, you can see that's a very simple example of just how a lot of jobs could just disappear if that was to be accepted. If people were receptive to such a kind of technology, when they're engaging with the state. 3D printing, additive manufacturing. There's I don't know if any of you are familiar with what Adidas have been up to recently, but Adidas, now it might have been Vietnam, but up to a couple of years ago they were producing their shoes in the kind of traditional manufacturing process which is quite labor intensive to actually create a shoe. But very recently, they basically shut down all their operations in the Far East and moved back to Germany. But rather than open up a bunch of shoe making factories in Germany, they opened up a very big warehouse and filled it with 3D printers and employed maybe a couple of hundred engineers to run it. The consequence of that was that maybe several thousand jobs, which were feeding into, I believe, the Vietnamese economy, were gotten rid of. And it's actually quite a strong demonstrator of just how quickly these things can happen, and just because we've seen in our current global environment, you've seen change, and I suppose we've seen rising economic nationalism, but you can see that what essentially is being advocated by that type of kind of national populism around solutions, bringing back production, etc. How that this may not actually be deliverable ultimately, because corporations will find it that if they're being forced to come back, that it will actually make more sense for them to invest in technology than actually create and pulling up a whole bunch of new factories and employ thousands of people.
One area I've seen machine learning is in medical diagnosis. So they're getting quite good at radiology.
Yeah.
You train them on it. Some companies recently got like 5,000 X-rays. You train them in on spotting tumours, and they're actually pretty good now.
Actually, one of the things I came across quite recently was actually a podcast, and I was talking about training in AI. But right now, AI is it's quite impressive, but actually there's still kind of thousands of people behind that AI training it in all the time. And that looks like that's going to be the way it's going to be for quite some time. The podcast is in the context of what the quality of kind of ICT jobs. And some of these ICT jobs that are being created today are not, from a human perspective, are actually quite mundane and very essentially boring, because all you're doing is you're training an AI to eventually replace you in a couple of years' time. But there's actually a very, very big industry for that. And actually, one of the things, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but I again only learned this recently. But your CAPTCHA that you find, like when you do the CAPTCHA thing to try and verify who you are, did you know you're training an AI? That basically the little pictures you have to identify. Okay, is it identified the car? When you identify the car correctly, that information is being fed to an algorithm, which is learning to identify what a car looks like, which is then being used to support the development of autonomous vehicles. So you're being, you're in some respects, when we talk about AI or we talk about the machines taking over, the machines are actually also affecting us and our behavior, and we're actually, in some respects, could be seen as part of the machine. If you want to take that view. And then there's obviously blockchain with the use of distributed ledger technologies. This is having a big impact in the financial services sectors and insurance industries. Naturally, we all know about big data and analytics. That's like what economists hasn't been presented to deal with that before. And obviously then what the traditional is the robotic process automation, which is is actually quite a bit more widespread, and I think this really captures it. This is basically the shipments of industrial robotics by region over the periods 2007 to 2016. So, as you can see, it's obviously increasing over time, and most notably in Asia and Australia. Now, in that particular region, but the vast majority of that is China, it's South Korea, and it's Japan. But as you can see that even between the period of 2011 to 2016, we've seen a 12% increase overall, with Asia and Australia seeing the largest increase of about nearly 53%, America seeing 37%, and Europe, unfortunately, behind the curve at 21%. However, it's also important to point out at this point that actually Europe is at a slightly higher starting point than the Americas in terms of trade in actual robotic technology. But as you can see, that the path is in one particular direction, and likely to continue that way for the foreseeable future. So these are the kind of so to inform basically this study. This is kind of what we looked at. The Frey and Osborne would have been, I suppose, one of the earliest and kind of more substantive attempt at trying to estimate this. Now it has been criticised for being potentially too gloomy about what the impact is at 47%. At high risk. Now I'll talk to you a bit more about that shortly. Arntz, Gregory, and Zierhan kind of came down pretty hard on Frey and Osborne in their analysis, and obviously they come up with a much smaller number. Again, we're talking about high risk automation here too. Now, Nedel, Koska, and Quintini is a much more recent one, and it kind of threads the needle here into order to get somewhere in between. What's interesting about this one is it looks very broadly similar to the Arntz, Gregory, and Zierhan, looking at the OECD, not just whereas Frey and Osborne was confined primarily to the United States, and PwC also in the States. Now you can notice that the average. And I've read a few of these different papers. Keensey has another one as well. It is somewhere, like in terms of the significant risk, let's say over 50% of automatability or whatnot. They do seem to, all of them seem to cluster around 30 to 40%, which I think is notable. Like this is basically jobs with a 50% or higher chance of being automated in the next 2 decades. So for this study, what we did is we chose Frey and Osborne and Nedel, Koska, and Quintini, basically just kind of give a sense of the first and the most recent study at the time of doing this that we could get our hands on. And they provide the basis of the estimates we then use to map against the Irish occupation structure. I also just, generally speaking, now, none of the authors are really willing to put that much of a number on in terms of a date for this to happen, but generally speaking, it's over 2 decades, and it's also it seems to be a general view that the higher the risk of automation, the more quickly or sooner an occupation is likely to be automated. So. Yeah, so these most of these now studies all kind of go back to what essentially was Frey and Osborne's first model, which was they modelled the risk probability of each occupation based on their assessment of how exposed the task profile of each occupation was to existing bottlenecks, and the existing bottlenecks that they identified based on. Their own expertise and also engagement with the industry were perception and manipulation. So what we mean by perception and manipulation is the ability to precisely coordinate movements, grasp, manipulate and assemble objects, and operate in cramped and awkward workspaces. Creative intelligence, which is the knowledge and techniques to generate novel and creative ideas, perform and create art. and social intelligence, the awareness and understanding of others' actions, emotions, and ability to negotiate, persuade, and provide care and assistance to others. So they're the kind of the three broadly speaking, kind of areas where today technology is still has a fair amount of ground to cover. So this is just kind of give you a sense of where the Frey Osborne, Nedelkoska and Quintini papers are coming from. So Frey Osborne modelled against the US occupation structure data, and they use the ONET task data to derive their estimates. However, the Nedelkoska and Quintini uses the ISCO occupation data for all OECD countries and links it back to the PIAC task data, which actually gives a bit better, a bit of a broader, a more detailed understanding of the task profile for different occupations when compared to the ONET task data. So what we then did was we took these estimates and we mapped them against Irish census data for 2016. This would then allow us to look at it across a number of different areas, as well as just looking at the straight occupations. So again, following basically what had been done previously in terms of scoring, so high risk is anything with a probability of automation of 70% or over. Significant risk was somewhere between 50% and 70%, and low risk is anything under 50%. So this basically just kind of reiterate what I just said. Because of Nedelkoska looked at all OECD countries, we were able to identify estimates specific to Ireland, whereas in the case of Frey Osborne, it took a bit of kind of basically a basic crosswalk technique where we just linked together the tables to allow us to map it from the US SOC to the UK SOC and then onto the Irish model. So there's a few more steps involved. There are, other than the different task data they were using, there were no, as a result, of the different task data they were using, you have some notable differences in the results you get. The Nedelkoska and Quintini actually had a better coverage of lower skilled jobs, as well as a more detailed task data. And this is partly due to the fact that Frey Osborne data based on ONET seemed to be seemed to exclude a lot of kind of jobs which didn't have much of an ICT element to them. So in some respects, it's kind of overestimating the impact of automation. And however, they did actually have better coverage of caring and assistance jobs. So there's a few other differences as well, which we noted a little bit earlier. I'd say there was a better coverage on the Nedelkoska and Quintini as a consequence of their data with the Irish occupation distribution. Yeah, we've been through this. One of the particular problems with the Frey Osborne is agriculture and their coverage of agriculture jobs. And again, the automation risk for occupations of social intelligence are likely to be overestimated because Nedelkoska and Quintini don't have the same coverage of caring and assistance type jobs. And neither are able to pick up much in the military or public occupations. So as of yet, my job doesn't have a automation estimate associated with it, and hopefully never will do. But nevertheless, both of these papers, primarily, as the rest of the study are primarily just looking at the negative aspect of this. It's not to say that there won't be other jobs created, but I suppose that kind of goes to kind of the heart of much of the debate around this is how much we need to worry about it. My own view on this is that if in previous kind of industrial revolutions where you've seen the rollout of technology displacing people's jobs, it tend to happen slower. I think there's a pacing difference now where, particularly with artificial intelligence, it does seem to be happening faster. And what worries me about that is how quickly, how short the time is for people to adapt. So if there are new jobs being created, what kind of opportunities people will actually have in the real world to retrain and get back into the labour market, and labour market services and or activation services, training, etc. They've come a long way, perhaps in the last 2 decades, but there still is this. It still takes time. There's still a lag, and faced with like an increasingly or automation accelerating, I believe that is a very serious challenge for us. Other kind of basically just one as I put with this is that, again, this is expert opinion based on technical capability. While it doesn't consider the substitution costs associated with adapting technology, equally the enterprise capacity to absorb technologies. I mean, this is enterprise capacity to absorb technology is I don't know if I'm not familiar with let's say productivity literature, but essentially this is a very big problem, and it's a big problem. It's affecting most of the advanced world at this point, trying to get SMEs, smaller companies, to actually start investing in technology so they can actually get benefits from productivity benefits from innovating. Then obviously there's the behavioural and societal responses to automation. Again, obviously this is going to vary from country to country. We already get the sense that maybe in certain parts of East Asia that they may be more receptive to the use of to do kind of regular engagement with technology. That may not necessarily hold in the West. There may be more kind of skepticism about it. There's also national legal or regulatory barriers, which are obviously going to vary from country to country. So again, those will have to be overcome, and how quickly the government can kind of roll out legislation to accommodate this. It will always kind of come up against the politics, etc. So that's always going to be challenging. And finally, and this is something that Nettle-Koska and continue to talk about at length in their paper, is the variation in task structure at amongst occupations at firm, regional, national levels. So basically what they're saying is that different states are at different levels of the kind of technology development path. So, or different, some are way ahead, so moving to technology will be easier moving more technology will be easier for them, whereas others won't be. The ability of, let's say, Romanian farmers to adapt technology is going to be different to Irish farmers. I mean, and this is interesting. Another kind of lag effect in terms of what you're likely to see, and this applies where it be even within a country in terms of enterprise A versus enterprise B in terms of there are different points, and so each one will be moving in this direction at a different pace. So results. So so basically we see here, this is the how they're both applied, what their overall results I suppose are for Ireland. So what we have is in the blue bars is the proportion of jobs which have a 70% risk of automation or higher, and the orange bar is for 50 to 70%. And then we have an average risk score, which for under each model, and then this is just the median of all of them, just so you know. So as you can see, there's notable difference. The Frey and Osborne is a third of jobs face a high risk of automation compared to about 15% under the Nettle-Koska and Quintini model. Equally, we're looking at a kind of a reversal of the pattern there in terms of 19% and significant risk versus 25%. However, the difference between the average is not necessarily as stark, which again goes back to what I initially said, and that it seems that when you look at this from overall averages, they all seem to be more or less coming out within the same area, the same ballpark. So I'll just go to what I've done next is I've kind of brought up to kind of a relatively high level in terms of occupations, given there are so many occupations. Now the paper itself has these in more detail, but this is broadly the occupation use. Now one thing just to know is like they're obviously using different categorizations. However, they are at this level. I think they're broadly comparable, and the result is actually not, they're not too different in terms of the type of occupations that they're identifying as most at risk. Now, notwithstanding the variation in the balance between high and significant risk. So again, it's your routine type occupations for the most part, whether it's process plant machine operatives or assemblers, as the case may be, in for Nettle Costco and Contini, elementary sales, clerical support. Now there is notable differences though, because you have sales marked significantly higher here, but lower there. Now again, this is pointing to the difference in the different in the methodology. The role of ICT as it exists in certain types of occupations is being it's being overestimated, I think, here, and that's part of the problem. Like and that's why which is I think it's the main source of deviation between these two. So essentially, Frey and Osborne, because their model is kind of basically looking at jobs which already have a ICT component in terms of their task profile, whereas the Nettle Costco and Contini is going broader than that. But again, broadly speaking, they're still coming out with the same kind of results. Notably, though, that there's a more graduated trend when we look at the Nettle Costco and Contini model versus the Frey and Osborne model. It's much more stark between those which are least exposed versus those which are most exposed. And this speaks to this kind of, there's also a debate around the extent to which mid-level jobs are actually exposed to automation. And that debate's still going on around, well, and that kind of speaks to, well, how much of the value of investment in education is a way of insulating yourself from automation.
When you say, let's say, sales, is that shops or stores in Ireland being automated?
Yeah.
But at the same time, you've got basically Amazon taking over the world.
Yeah.
Right? So Sears has just gone belly up
Yeah.
in the US. They just can't cope. Well, a lot of people can't cope. So I mean, if Amazon just keeps expanding.
Yeah.
That's internet based.
Yeah.
And so lots of retailers in Ireland.
Yeah, and that is not because that the specific person behind the till is actually being turned into a robot. I mean, to be literal about it, that's not why. It's because their industry is being is the structure of the sector is being changed by technology, insofar as almost it's the ICT sector almost absorbing the retail sector to a certain degree, and this is kind of like a second order effect, which isn't necessarily being captured that much in the existing research that I can find so far. There's a few case studies which are quite enlightening around this fact that, especially in something like sales, equally in kind of retail banking, that sort of stuff, where the mobile phone in itself is wiping out jobs. It's wiping out. It's wiping out the high street to a certain degree. So that's another further limitation to looking to this kind of analysis, that it doesn't actually allow you to get into to look at that kind of stuff. But that is, and that's where it becomes more difficult to predict where the likely impacts of this are going to be ultimately, because we don't know what new innovation is going to come along and completely restructure or reshape our existing markets. But just one final thing, again, you can see that those jobs that we generally associate with higher educational qualifications do tend to come out on top in terms of, or they're the least automatable. Interestingly, we have caring as well shows up. which is also very important insofar as, I mean, that how automatable is the interaction with, at a human level when we're looking at care and health services.
That's good. Do you have the distribution of the number of people that work in these jobs?
Yeah. I don't have the distribution here, but I'll show you the sectoral stuff, which gives you kind of a flavour of that as well, which I think is on the next slide or next one after that. So this is the sectoral breakdown for each side, for each paper. I see agriculture is scoring the highest in both instances. Again, you can see the difference in the balance due to the fact that due to the different methodological approach. Construction is in the top 5 in both instances, transportation and storage. Admin and support services is there. Industry, BTE, so that's a kind of catch-all for essentially manufacturing, is very high under the F&O, but not to the same degree under N&Q, which kind of speaks to the fact that we've discussed previously around, just how positioned a lot of industries actually are to absorb technology into their processes or into their manufacturing or whatnot. But again, the broad pattern is somewhat replicated insofar as those sectors which, again, we traditionally associate with higher levels of education do tend to be the ones with or higher levels of education, but also a very strong kind of human interaction element to them as well. So education, health, and social worker tend to show up as the least likely to be negatively impacted by automation. Interesting with this one, professional, scientific, and tech. It's kind of middle here, but it tends to be much less there, which I thought was kind of interesting. But and again, I think it kind of goes down to the weaknesses of the Frey and Osborne paper. So here we have employment by sector. So I mean, this might give you a sense of what of the number of people who are likely to be affected. So look, like when we look at wholesale, retail, industry. Human health, or wholesale retail anyway, is a very large employer. This is over 300,000 people in 2016, or Q4 2017, sorry. Followed by industry. Human health and social work, again, is a very big employer. But as I say, as we kind of so like you're seeing a lot of, like, it's a bit, obviously some sectors have seen some very kind of dramatic changes in recent years anyway. I mean, look at this, which is looking at the change in employment in the last 10 years. We have construction, which obviously was wiped out by the crisis and is now there's serious skills shortages in this area. That's been driven by the economic cycle as opposed to automation per se. But nevertheless, I think it's relatively instructive because, again, those sectors which are more exposed do tend to be the ones which are seeing the largest decline. Actually, very recently, in fact, as early as last Thursday, there's a paper produced in King's College London by Manny, which linked, it was kind of a cross-country, cross-industry study, which is linked the investment in technology with the declining share of labour. And I think that there's a growing amount of evidence which is pointing to this, that notwithstanding the effects of globalisation, notwithstanding the recent change in the recent economic cycle, so to speak, that over the last 20, 30 years, technology has been having an impact, and it's an impact which is continuing, and we haven't really been paying enough attention to it, I think. And this is especially the case with those workers which are lower or low to medium skilled.
It does seem though like the sectors, it's kind of hard to compare because they're not the same categories, but the sectors that are at most risk seem to have the fewest people.
Yeah, well, other than hotel and retail, in Ireland. But I think Ireland has gone through has kind of moved up the value chain anyway over the last 20 to 30 years. I mean, we're not as exposed, and this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about differences between countries in terms of how they can absorb new technology and how likely it is to change how occupations are structured. Where, like, you know, Ireland has a very sizable, there's a sizable number of people involved in professional, scientific and technical industry in terms of manufacturing, particularly in pharmaceuticals, and to a lesser degree, but nevertheless quite substantive in the ICT sector. Those jobs already have a high level of automation anyway, and people and the people working in those jobs the first thing, they're probably highly educated anyway, but are also are probably better positioned to adapt to technology, because those type of jobs, I think, by and large, are quite sophisticated anyway, in relative terms, versus sitting behind a till. So there are going to be differences between sectors both in terms of, let's say, where sectors are more generally in terms of the level of how much technology is being applied versus and the same goes for, like, you know, countries and regions, etc. I hope that made sense. So this is the regions in Ireland. This is the regions based on the former version of the LFS. So the LFS is the Labour Force Survey. It's replaced the quarterly National Household Survey last year, but earlier this year they also introduced a helpful change to the regional breakdown. So basically they moved South Tipperary, and they moved Louth, because Louth's no longer in the border anymore, it's now in the Mid-East. So anyway, so that was helpful. So these aren't necessarily as accurate as they could be, because I haven't updated it. But nevertheless, there's also, you can see a pattern here too. In both instances, you're looking at Dublin, Mid-East, Midlands, West, or what specifically, well, not so much the West there, but the Southwest. These are the areas of the country where you have a greater footprint of, I suppose, more advanced industries, relative to the southeast and the border regions, where these are the regions which have suffered quite much worse than the other regions over the course of the crisis. Their economic performance has generally been weaker, and a lot of that's got to do with the fact that when it comes to particularly FDI, they don't perform as well as Dublin or the Greater Dublin area, or the Southwest, insofar as like the kind of Cork, Kerry pharmaceutical clustering. So in many ways, like what technology seems to be is compounding what is already regional disparities, or will do. And this is by education. This is no real surprise, I suppose. It's very clear that the more you invest in education, the less automatable you are. I find it funny that actually having no or primary education is you're less likely than if you are having lower upper secondary. So leaving certificate is actually a bit of a liability in this one. But I suspect, again, this is again down to the role of kind of how much of these kind of jobs that people have with this level of education already have a significant ICT component, and then, or how much of it ultimately, like, it is, a lot of it's very labour intensive. A lot of this kind of work. So there are more. It is interesting to see how that's going to play out. Yeah. So
just to go back to that, I mean, this suggests that it might increase inequality. It's going to drag the left tail down, right tail. Oh, I'm all right, Jack.
Well, within the next 2 decades, you're all right. I don't know what happens after that.
I'm tired. I don't care.
But yeah, it is, and I think that speaks to what a lot of the literature is already talking about around if automation takes begins to be a bigger part of the economy, then naturally the share of income going to labor is going to shrink. Because it'll be going to capital. Technology is capital. So it is going to push. I think this seems to kind of, I suppose, echo that those people who actually are in a better position in society, as it is, are the ones who are going to continue to benefit, or at least in relative terms, compared to those who are at the lower end.
Can you perform an analysis that takes into account the field of education? It would be pretty interesting to see whether, like, subjects like, literature or philosophy, which are very less likely to be substituted by automated processes.
I think I think you can at a relatively broad level. It wouldn't necessarily be as right down to particular types of degree, but I think it is possible to do that. Yeah, it might be worth looking at actually. But yeah, I think that would be quite useful. In fact, there may well ever be work already done on that by the OECD. I think I'd have to check, but yeah, that would certainly be useful to see what type of disciplines are, I suppose, more at risk than others. Even within those which are relatively low risk, there's obviously going to be differences. So, I suppose just to kind of give you to sum up what the basic findings of this are, we see that there's obviously was variation based on the high risk categories. There's obviously Frey and Osborne is essentially double what Nittlekoska and Quintini are saying. But again, I suspect it's probably going to be someplace in between. The average, though, I think is striking. 2 in 5 jobs, that's essentially over 1 million jobs today, are likely have a kind of a 50% or higher chance of being automated over the next 2 decades. So I think that's pretty stark. Now, as I say, what that actually looks like in when it happens, we're not in a position to say, so to speak, but nevertheless, it's going to change a lot of jobs. It's going to change what these jobs actually entail for the humans which are still working in them. May even change ultimately how labour intensive. Obviously, it will change how labour intensive they are. But again, are the jobs that will now be our full-time jobs that are existing full-time jobs going to end up as part-time jobs or part of other jobs? Like there's so many kind of variations on how this could impact. But nevertheless, 2 in 5 jobs is striking. Unsurprisingly, we see that it's the routine type jobs which are most at risk. Caring, education, health management, and professional occupations are least at risk, which kind of tends to link up with the fact that higher education reduces automation risk. The sectoral impact varies, but again, transport and agriculture tend to come out as largely the worst to be affected, followed by construction, retail, admin, food and accommodation. And as I say, the southeast border regions seem to be the ones which are likely to get the biggest hit, largely down to the fact that employment in these areas is largely going to be in the sectors which are most at risk from automation. So I suppose then to kind of bring it to a kind of a conclusion, this is like what do we need to think about from a kind of policy perspective in terms of addressing this over the next couple of years or responding to it. So we have variable disruptive impacts due to differences in absorptive capacity and the how society and government and industry is likely to respond to it. One thing really kind of struck me when I was in China recently, and in one of the very noticeable things was the use of Alipay and WePay very, very. I mean, it's this Shanghai was very was obviously quite a well developed super city, and but everybody was using it. Didn't matter who you were, everybody was using it. No, people preferred to see you.
What is it?
Alipay. It's like Google Pay, but it's for China, so it's Alipay or it's WePay, and they basically when you want to, wherever you want to buy something, you scan your phone. You don't scan a card, you don't give them cash, you scan your phone. So it's a pay app, but it's very, 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 very extensive. I mean, I remember trying to buy stuff, and getting awkward looks because I was presenting cash. So obviously there's going to be some cultures. It seems that there's very big differences. Some, I don't know how, they're already ahead of the game in this kind of stuff. They've already adapted. This is the norm. But I mean, we're still using coins. We're still using we're using cards. It's just funny the differences that are there, and it may point to the fact that you are going to have these different attitudes towards technology in different parts of the world. And again, the jury's out ultimately, and is this going to bring the end of jobs, end of careers? Are we all going to basically spending our days sitting around playing video games, or what? Is that where it's going? That's unlikely, but even if it does happen, it's probably far, far away. But nevertheless, the traditional occupation model, as we've been kind of taught to expect, is unlikely to survive. It's changing as it is. I mean, the emergence of the gig economy is a good example of that. That's been driven primarily by technology, mobile platforms, which are facilitating that. And in some ways, notwithstanding the insecurity and issues about the precariat, etc., that go with that, in some ways you can see it as a kind of a response to the role of technology in terms of the labour market as we know it, because in some ways the gig economy is freeing people up. It's giving them more time. They can now interact with their jobs in a much more flexible way than would have been the case before mobile technology comes along, before the apps come along. Now, obviously, government has a very big responsibility here in ensuring that doesn't lead to exploitation, and it's pretty clear that in places like the United States and the UK and other parts of the Western world, that governments have failed to do that, and there is exploitation, and there is security. People do feel they lack security, etc. So and that's also potentially contributing to the issue, Kevin, you just raised around growing inequality. So those people who are in jobs which don't have, with jobs which aren't going to be automated, have more secure jobs, versus those people who are in jobs which are more automatable, such as the person delivering your Deliveroo. That person is going to be much more insecure, and but that's partly been driven by what technology has been doing to that sector. So that's a very big challenge that we're going to have to think about. Speaking to that as well is what this is going to do to, again, inequality more broadly. So if the labour share is falling, the capital share is increasing. Capital is owned by a smaller number of people. Are we looking at a situation where market structure it devolves into kind of essentially monopolies? And this also, by the way, has a big impact on long-term productivity, or at least human productivity, whatever about the robots. But again, that's putting a lot of power in the hands of the owners of capital. And is that what we want? Is that, or is there things we can do that is going to kind of insulate us against the kind of negative implications of that? I'd say it's straightforward, that's wealth distribution, it's income inequality. And then I suppose where we're kind of seeing it today, I suppose, with the emergence of populism, what the effect of that has on the civic space with technology. If technology it comes along and it's not properly regulated, and we just let it run rip, are we risking wider economic dislocation? And it has been said that it is the automation has played a part in the rise of economic nationalism. a lot of those blue collar workers who ended up voting for Trump, you know, it wasn't just globalization, it wasn't China. A lot of that was also automation. Is the fact that their jobs no longer exist because there's a piece of software which does it. So why would you employ somebody? Equally, Brexit may also is part. You know that it off. You know, this is another kind of aspect of that. The idea that you can bring in that, you know, you can bring jobs back, etc. You know, if the technology, like over the next couple of decades, you know, technology is going to make that claim increasingly dubious. So finally, then, what could government do at the moment? So we can look at education reform, invest in lifelong learning, continuous reskilling. So people who do find themselves out of a job because, you know, it's been automated, that they have the option, that we have the institutional investment made, that people can move back into training and education so that they can equip themselves with the skills. This isn't going to solve all the problems, but it's something that we do need to do. I do more of. Ireland hasn't performed necessarily quite well in this space historically. If there is, like, I mean, a lot of the focus on current government policies to improve this, but nevertheless, there's compared to some of our peers in in the Nordic countries, etc., we are quite behind on this. There's also the fact that maybe when people are going to look at, well, what they want to be when they grow up as such, what careers do you want? Do we have to be a bit more realistic about the choices we make if the jobs really aren't going to be there? So, and also, I mean, this also speaks to stuff around like aging. Aging is, in one sense, these two things kind of go together. With an aging population, you'll have more people who are likely going to need more caring. So in a sense, there's a market emerging there too for people to consider when they're thinking about their careers, to invest in caring, because it's one thing which isn't going to necessarily be automated, at least not right away. Then of course there's different ways of looking at how you work. Are we going to see an increase in teleworking, shorter working week? It's interesting, New Zealand, a company in New Zealand, again I can't think, terrible to remember the names of these places or these companies, but essentially there's an interesting experiment in New Zealand where a company trialed a 4-day week. I think it was in financial services, but they tried it for a year and then decided that they were just going to do it. So they've just switched from a 5-day week to a 4-day week, and it has no impact on their productivity. So is this something we're going to see a bit more of? Obviously, we already have job sharing, but maybe that's going to grow. And again, then there's multiple lifetime careers, which probably for many people will be the what's the most likely outcome for them. And I spoke earlier about, again, the gig economy. There's this important balance between security and flexibility, and that requires regulation and actually constant kind of monitoring about how it's evolving too. And then finally, the great white hope, universal basic income. This has been around for a long time. The right and the left both at different times advocated this, and it's been trialled to a certain degree in certain places. I mean, Finland attempted it, but it doesn't seem like the implementation worked out that well. Switzerland had a vote on it, and they didn't vote for it. But it still seems to be the main thing, the only thing we can think about in the long term for people at the moment. Or at the very least, even if it doesn't come to that, I think it's pretty clear that we're going to have to re-engineer our entire social welfare model anyway. I think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be the social welfare model, our education system. I mean, I think we can expect to see some pretty profound changes in those areas in the next 10 to 20 years, assuming we can afford it, of course. Which is, we'll see about that. So, and I'll leave it there.